Imagine handing a single soldier a weapon light enough to carry across a field, setting it up on a small tripod, and using it to fire a nuclear explosion at an enemy about a mile away. Now imagine that the burst of radiation released by that explosion was so intense that it could kill the very man who pulled the trigger. This was not a thought experiment. It was a real weapon deployed by the United States Army, and it was called the Davy Crockett. It was, in effect, an atomic bazooka, and it was just one of the strangest creations of an era when two superpowers prepared with deadly seriousness to fight a war that thankfully never came. Over the next 16 minutes, we are going to look at the machines built for the Third World War, the apocalyptic clash between the United States and the Soviet Union that an entire generation believed was coming any day. For decades, the world's most brilliant engineers and its deepest military budgets were poured into hardware designed for a conflict so total that it would have reshaped the planet. Nuclear weapons a man could carry, aircraft powered by reactors, missiles meant to poison whole countries as they flew, bombs so large they were almost pointless. And the strangest thing of all about these machines is that the only reason we can stand here and marvel at them today is that the war they were built for never actually happened. Stay with me, because the deeper we go into this arsenal, the more you will wonder how the world ever survived its own imagination. To understand why any of these machines were built, you have to understand the logic of the Cold War, a logic that was equal parts genius and madness. Both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over, and both sides knew it. The grim theory that kept the peace was that neither superpower would dare strike first, because doing so would guarantee its own destruction in the retaliation that followed. But that fragile balance created a bottomless hunger for new weapons, because each side was terrified of falling behind, of letting the other invent some breakthrough that would tip the scales. So money flowed almost without limit. Ideas that would have been dismissed as insane in any other era were funded, tested, and sometimes built. The reasoning was always the same. If there was even a small chance a weapon might matter in the war everyone expected, it had to be pursued, no matter how dangerous, how absurd, or how expensive. Some of that thinking went so far that engineers even sketched out designs for nuclear-powered tanks. And our first two machines show just how far down that road the great powers were willing to travel. The Davy Crockett, that atomic bazooka, was a product of pure Cold War paranoia. The fear was that massed Soviet tanks would come pouring across the plains of Europe in numbers too great for ordinary weapons to stop. The American answer was to give small groups of soldiers their own tactical nuclear weapon, a warhead small enough to be fired from a recoilless gun and carried close to the front lines. On paper, it was a way to vaporize an entire enemy advance with a single shot. In practice, it was terrifying for everyone involved, including the men who would use it. The warhead was small as nuclear weapons go, but the radiation it released was lethal across a wide area, an area that, depending on the range, could easily overlap with the position of the crew that had just fired it. To use the Davy Crockett properly might mean dooming the very soldiers operating it. Thousands were built and deployed through the 1960s before the weapon was quietly withdrawn. It was a nuclear weapon designed to be aimed by a handful of men standing dangerously close to the blast they were about to create. If the Davy Crockett was frightening, our next machine was something close to darkly comic, and it came from Britain. In the 1950s, British planners worried that if the Soviets ever invaded Western Europe, they would sweep across the plains of Germany before they could be stopped. So they devised a plan to bury enormous nuclear landmines in the path of that advance, weapons that could be detonated to create zones of radioactive devastation that no army could cross. The project was given the harmless-sounding name Blue Peacock, but the engineers ran into a very practical problem. Buried underground through a cold European winter, the delicate electronics inside the bombs might freeze and fail. They needed a way to keep the devices warm. And according to declassified documents, one of the proposed solutions was almost unbelievable. They considered sealing live chickens inside the casing of the bomb, along with food and water, so that the simple body heat of the animals would keep the nuclear device warm enough to function. A nuclear weapon kept alive by chickens. The Blue Peacock project was eventually canceled, partly over the obvious dangers of leaving live nuclear mines buried in the territory of an ally. But it remains one of the strangest ideas the nuclear age ever produced. So far, our machine stayed on the ground. The next idea tried to take a nuclear reactor into the sky. In the United States, military planners dreamed of a bomber that would never have to land, an aircraft powered not by fuel that could run out, but by its own onboard nuclear reactor, allowing it to stay airborne for days or even weeks at a time, ready to strike at a moment's notice. To explore this, engineers took a giant bomber and fitted it with a working nuclear reactor, then actually flew it. The aircraft, known as the NB-36, did not use the reactor to power its flight. The reactor was carried aloft so engineers could study how it behaved in the air, and, above all, how to shield a human crew from its radiation. The men who flew it sat inside a special cockpit lined with lead and thick glass, a shielded capsule designed to keep them alive, while a live nuclear reactor hummed in the belly of the plane behind them. It flew dozens of times. But the dream of a truly nuclear-powered bomber ran into enormous problems, from the sheer weight of the shielding to the nightmare of what would happen if such an aircraft ever crashed and scattered its reactor across the landscape. By the early 1960s, the entire program was abandoned. The idea of a flying reactor patrolling the skies forever was simply too dangerous to make real. The flying reactor was frightening enough as a bomber. The next project turned that same idea into something far worse, a weapon designed not just to deliver destruction, but to be destruction itself. It was called Project Pluto, and the weapon it aimed to build was a nuclear-powered cruise missile. The concept was almost beyond belief. A missile driven by a small nuclear reactor that would let it fly for thousands of miles, skimming low over the ground at more than 3 times the speed of sound, dropping hydrogen bombs on target after target. But the genius and the horror of the design was that the missile did not need to drop anything to cause devastation. As it flew, its unshielded reactor would spray a trail of radiation across everything beneath its path. Its thunderous shockwave alone, traveling at supersonic speed at low altitude, could shatter and flatten whatever lay below. Even after it had dropped its last bomb, the missile could keep flying, poisoning and pulverizing the enemy simply by passing overhead. Engineers actually built and successfully tested the nuclear engine on the ground, proving the terrifying machine could work. But the missile itself was never built or flown. The weapon was judged to be too provocative, too uncontrollable, and too monstrous even for the Cold War. And the project was canceled in 1964. It was a doomsday machine that its own creators decided the world was better off without. Not every Cold War experiment reached for the apocalypse. Some simply tried to do the impossible, like building a fighter jet that took off from the open sea. In the 1950s, American engineers pursued the idea of a supersonic seaplane, a jet fighter that needed no runway and could operate from the water itself, rising onto a pair of retractable skis to skim across the surface and into the air. It was called the Sea Dart, and for a moment it seemed like the future, a warplane that could be based anywhere there was water, free from vulnerable airfields. But taming a machine that had to be both a boat and a supersonic jet proved brutally difficult. The skis caused violent vibrations as the aircraft skipped across the waves. And during one demonstration flight in 1954, in front of a watching crowd, one of the prototypes was pushed too hard and disintegrated in the air, killing its test pilot. The dream of a fleet of supersonic seaplane fighters died with that aircraft. It was a beautiful, daring idea that the laws of physics simply refused to allow. The Americans were not alone in chasing strange machines. On the other side of the world, the Soviet Union was building something that looked like it came from another planet. Skimming low across the Caspian Sea, American spy satellites spotted an enormous craft that baffled Western analysts. It was the size of an airliner, with stubby wings, and it raced just above the surface of the water at incredible speed. They nicknamed it the Caspian Sea Monster. It was an ekranoplan, a vehicle that was neither truly a ship nor truly an aircraft, but something in between. It flew on a cushion of air trapped between its wings and the surface of the water, allowing it to carry massive loads at high speed while staying low enough to slip beneath enemy radar. Later versions were fitted with huge missiles, turning them into fast-moving sea raiders meant to strike enemy fleets. They were astonishing machines, and for certain missions they worked. But they were difficult to control, limited to operating over relatively calm water, and enormously expensive. And as the Cold War wound down, the strange sea monsters were largely abandoned, left to rust as relics of a war that never arrived. The strangest places these machines were built were not always in the sky or on the sea. Sometimes they were hidden beneath the ice. In the 1960s, the United States Army pursued one of the most ambitious secret projects of the entire Cold War, a plan to hide a network of nuclear missiles deep within the Greenland ice cap, ready to be fired at the Soviet Union from a place the enemy would never expect. The plan was called Project Iceworm, and to support the research behind it, the Army built a real base beneath the ice, a small underground city of tunnels carved into the glacier, complete with living quarters and powered by its own portable nuclear reactor. For a time, men actually lived and worked in this frozen world. But the planners had underestimated the ice itself. A glacier is not solid and still. It flows and shifts, slowly but with enormous force, and the moving ice began to squeeze and deform the tunnels, crushing the frozen city from all sides. Within just a few years, the base became unsafe, and the entire dream of a hidden nuclear fortress under Greenland was abandoned. The Cold War had run headlong into nature, and nature had won. And finally, we come to the most extreme machine of all, the ultimate expression of an age obsessed with the apocalypse. In 1961, the Soviet Union detonated the largest nuclear weapon ever built or tested in human history. It was called the Tsar Bomba, and its power was almost impossible to comprehend. A blast of roughly 50 megatons, many times more powerful than all the bombs dropped in the entire Second World War combined. The flash was seen from hundreds of miles away. The shockwave circled the entire planet, and astonishingly, this monstrous device had originally been designed to be twice as powerful still, around 100 megatons, before it was deliberately scaled back out of fear that a full-strength blast might be too dangerous even to test. But here is the most telling fact about the Tsar Bomba. It was almost completely useless as an actual weapon. It was far too large and too heavy to be delivered practically in a real war, and a single bomb that big made little military sense when smaller weapons could do the job. It was never meant to be used in battle at all. It was a statement, a demonstration of raw power designed to frighten the world. The most powerful weapon ever created existed not to win a war, but to prove that its makers could end one. That is the thread that ties every one of these machines together. From an atomic bazooka a single man could fire to a 50-megaton bomb that could be seen from space. Each was built for a war that the smartest and most powerful people in the world were absolutely certain was coming. Billions were spent. Brilliant minds were consumed. Lives were risked and, in some cases, lost, all in preparation for a final battle between two superpowers that, in the end, never came. The Davy Crockett, the Blue Peacock, the Flying Reactor, the Doomsday Missile, the Supersonic Seaplane, the Sea Monster, the City Under the Ice, and the Tsar Bomba are the strange and frightening monuments of that anxious age. And the greatest irony of all is this. The most successful weapons on this entire list are the ones that were never used. Because every one of these machines was built for a war whose arrival would have meant the end of the world. And the fact that they sit in museums and scrapyards today, instead of having been fired in anger, is the quiet proof that, against all odds, the apocalypse they were made for never came. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. The real verdict on the machine's history would rather forget. I will see you in the next one.